watching it online.
It's live now.
You're live.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us for this American Jewish World Service Facebook Live National Update here with our AJWS Advocacy team. I'm Sherry Turitz, the Vice President for Programs here at AJWS. As many of you know, inspired by Jewish values, AJWS is an international human rights organization that supports social justice advocates around the world who are fighting for civil rights and against governments that are attempting to curb those rights and discriminate against marginalized populations. The groups that we support include lesbians, gays, bisexuals, and transgender people, women and girls, youth, indigenous people, ethnic minorities, and people around the world who are recovering from massive natural disasters. With the beginning of this new administration, we see far-reaching consequences for the human rights issues and advocates that we support. So in the next half an hour, what we hope to do is three things. First, we want to give you a live update for what we see as the big picture of what's happening in DC today in the early stages of this new administration. Next, we want to tell you more specifically about how we see the changes in Washington on our key human rights issues and the issues affecting our partners around the world. And lastly, we want to let you know how you can continue to work with us and take actions to continue to hold the line on certain key human rights issues that protect our core values as Americans. So today I'm joined here by two of my colleagues, Tracy Gerd. Tracy is the Senior Director for Civil and Political Rights and Advocacy here at AJWS, and also Jen Redner. Jen is the Senior Policy Advisor on Sexual Health and Rights. And before we jump in, I'd just like to thank all of you for joining us today for this call, and especially for sending in some really great questions that we will address as part of this next half an hour. So first, over to you, Tracy. Why is AJWS interested in discussions of U.S. foreign policy? Why is this important to us?
Thank you, Sharon. Welcome, everyone. Yeah, I think this question about our involvement in U.S. foreign policy really goes to the core of what we do here at AJWS, which is promoting human rights and working to end poverty in the developing world. U.S. policies, laws, and actions have always been so important to really achieving this goal. And maybe to explain why that is, I'll just give a little bit of background for our viewers about what it is that we do and why it's so important. So we work in 19 countries in the developing world. We have around 450 partners. And what this means is we work with some of the most marginalized people in the world who are fighting for some of the most basic human rights. So this includes, for example, women who are mobilizing to vote and expressing their opinions after conflict in places like Sierra Leone or Sri Lanka. It includes local communities who are fighting exploitation by companies who about their land or their water in places like Mexico or Guatemala. Now, what this means is because the U.S. has a position as a global superpower, the U.S. government policies on foreign aid, on human rights, on trade can really have an outsized impact on communities like these. And it makes the difference of whether the U.S. stands up to dictators who are mistreating their own people, or whether the U.S. gives foreign aid money to promote human rights or build democracy, or even to respond to disasters and reconstruct societies after disasters like earthquakes, for example. So these are all key things that affect our partners. And this is why we've really been at the forefront of some really important fights in foreign policy in DC over the last 15 years. Food aid reform is one of them, pushing the U.S. government to support stateless people in places like the Dominican Republic, or encouraging the U.S. to support the rights of lesbian and gay people who are being criminalized in countries like Uganda. And what we're fearing is that these battles will become even more intense now with this new administration and Congress.
Well, let's dive into that a bit. Jen, the president has been in power for a little under 2 weeks. Can you tell us what you and AJWS are most concerned about right now?
Yeah, thanks for that question, and welcome again to all of you tuning in right now. I think
what we're witnessing even in the first 13 days of this new administration is a radical departure of the previous administration in a number of areas. But I think thematically we can discuss the departure in three main areas. The first of which is the people. Who is he surrounding himself with? I think Mr. Bannon, as his chief strategist, as well as the newly appointed Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, are two examples of those types of people that are causing us some concern. Secondly is around policy. We've seen a number of actions in these early days of the administration that are deeply concerning. The refugee ban, which I know we'll talk a little bit about, and then also the global gag rule. The Mexico City policy is another example. Thirdly is around the foreign assistance budget. And it's not only about what those dollars are, what that amount is, but what are the priorities associated with those dollars. And those are sort of the three main areas that I think are causing the greatest concern in the earliest days of the administration.
So Jen, we've heard a lot in the last week about the president's new executive orders. Can you talk a little bit about those that we're most concerned about and maybe give us an example of how any one of those might affect our grantees?
Sure, good question. And absolutely, the Mexico City policy, or the dreaded global gag rule, is not a new policy per se. It's been in place, rescinded and reinstated depending on which party is in power since 1984. So what's interesting about this is that 48 hours after one of the largest mobilizations for women's rights in the history of our country, this executive order was placed with a stroke of a pen, but was expanded dramatically. Essentially what this policy is it says, even with your non-U.S. taxpayer dollars, so whether it's coming from private foundations, other governments, etc., it dictates what you can use those dollars for and certainly what you cannot use them for. So of all the US, if you accept U.S. global health dollars, essentially you must agree to not provide abortion services, counsel related to abortion services, refer for abortion services, and even extends to your ability to be able to advocate to your own government or educate your own government, not only about the ills of unsafe abortion, but the importance of providing safe abortion services. So really it's a gross extension of U.S. law that currently exists.
And how do you see it affecting? Give us an example of one of our partners.
Sure. So as I said, it's not a new policy, but it's been expanded in a dramatically new way. Previously, in its iterations, for example, under President Bush, it extended only to voluntary family planning funds, so about $575 million per year. Now it applies to all global health dollars. So we're actually talking about a 15-time increase, or over $9 billion of U.S. foreign assistance that's now affected. So when we think about what that looks like in a life of a partner or in a rural community around the world, you're often talking about the only clinic that may exist in a community. And they provide a range of services: HIV prevention, malaria, nutrition, even in certain countries, Zika prevention efforts, maternal and child health. So really it's the lifeline for a lot of these communities. And in addition, they may be providing abortion services, counseling or referring, and or conducting advocacy with their non-U.S. tax dollars. Well, essentially, again, what this policy states is that these individuals have to make an impossible decision. They either provide these life-saving services, HIV prevention, etc., or they uphold the basic human rights of women and girls to be able to have access to information and services to make decisions about their own lives.
And the irony of all of this, which we've been hearing, is that the evidence says it doesn't even decrease the number of abortions around the world.
No, in fact, it actually increases the likelihood. It not only increases unsafe abortion, but unintended pregnancies, maternal deaths. It has the absolute opposite intent of its policy.
Wow. Okay. Thanks, Jen. Tracy, let's get back a minute to this issue of the appointments. Also this week, there's been a lot of news about the latest cabinet appointments. Can you tell us a bit about the recent appointments, the ones we're most concerned about, and why?
Sure. You know, just going back to what Jen was saying earlier, what we're seeing now is quite a radically different approach to picking some of the top positions in the new administration's cabinet. So if we take, for example, one of the key positions that's really important to us, which is the Secretary of State position, this was one that was just confirmed yesterday. So this is Rex Tillerson. Now, the Secretary of State position is really America's top diplomat. Historically, it's really been a key one for promoting human rights around the globe. Now, Rex Tillerson comes into this position not only not having a track record in government policy or in human rights, but instead he's actually been the CEO of ExxonMobil. Now, this is a company that has polluted the global environment. It has denied the science about climate change, even while it's profited from the causes of climate change. And it's cozied up to some repressive governments, Equatorial Guinea, Angola, Russia. So what this makes us worried about in particular is whether Tillerson will be someone who will stand up for freedom of speech, freedom of assembly and association, all those core civil and political rights that are really key to making change in societies, given his connection with these repressive governments. But more generally, our concern is that we are working with some of these local indigenous communities who are fighting to protect their land, their water, their forests from really exploitative oil drilling, from logging, from coal mining that's conducted without their consent. So Tillerson, given his history with these corporations and not with human rights, we're really worried that he may exacerbate the problems that these communities face rather than alleviate them. So he may actually be worse for the environment and for the people whose lives depend on it.
Yeah, wow. Okay. Jen, you mentioned foreign assistance. What is it that we can expect to see in terms of spending for foreign assistance moving forward?
Yeah, unfortunately, the prospects as of now are quite dismal. I think despite the fact that the foreign assistance that the United States spends every year amounts to less than 1% of the entire federal budget, it is under attack already. We have very early and strong indications that the president's budget will ask for extreme cuts to the budget, to the development assistance that we talk about as being critical for not only the articulation of our U.S. foreign policy and the articulation of our Jewish values around human rights, around democracy and governments, around climate change, etc. But we expect not only the amount to drastically increase, but the direction of where that aid flows to change dramatically, both in scope and geography. So let me give you an example of what that really looks like. I talked a little bit about global health already and the implications of the global gag rule, the Mexico City policy, which we know renders current investments just less effective. We also know as AJWS that what is in our interest as a country is to not only protect and fulfill the human rights of all, but to ensure that people are healthy, prosperous. That is in our national security interests. That dialogue is being reframed away from a human rights-based perspective into a more trade perspective, into a very self-interested perspective that actually puts a lot of the same people in harm's way and actually makes us less safe and more vulnerable. So it's actually very, very frightening. And again, as I said, it comprises less than 1% of our foreign budget, and even a smaller fraction of that is related to our funding and contribution to the United Nations. That contribution is a critical contribution for a number of reasons. There is a reason why the United Nations system was established. For those of you who don't know, in 1948, the Human Rights Declaration established the UN system as well as core universal human rights that all of us aspire to espouse. That international system is under attack. And so we expect there to be proposed budget cuts not only to the United Nations, but to some of the core programs that are serving the communities in which we're working. And when we're talking about serving the most marginalized populations, we're talking about women and girls, we're talking about lesbian, gay, transgender, bisexual, we're talking about indigenous populations with little to no access to resources. So changes and shifts in priorities of the US government and its US foreign assistance has real implications in terms of real lives.
Thanks. So, Tracy, I mentioned before that AJWS supports thousands of human rights activists, human rights defenders around the world. I often say that when I go on site visits visiting our 19 countries, that about 70% of the advocates that I meet with are under some sort of threat. Some of them a mortal threat, others threaten to be arrested. So I'm curious for you to respond to this idea of what do we expect in this next administration in terms of protections or support for those human rights advocates around the world?
That's such a crucial question, Shari. And in fact, it really makes me think of one of our key partners. His name is Adrian Juko, and he is just an amazing Ugandan human rights lawyer who has been standing up for the rights of gay, lesbian, and trans people in Uganda at a time when its own parliament wanted to institute the death penalty just for being gay. Now, he's been threatened. His office has been ransacked. One of his security guards has been murdered, all because he was doing this work to try and protect and promote the rights of LGBT people. Now, it got so bad at one point that the US government really had to step in and try and protect him and defend him from his own government. And what we're concerned about now is really the question, will the US continue to do this kind of intervention for these critical human rights defenders going forward? Or will they actually just stand by and allow these repressive governments who may feel emboldened to go ahead and continue to repress their own people, unafraid of the US stepping in, watching, or even caring what they do? So it's a really big concern for us and our partners.
Yes, thank you. So Jen, given this really challenging situation, can you update us a bit about what in the last 2 weeks AJWS has been doing to respond to the situation?
Yeah, absolutely. And hopefully many of you who have been watching have already been participating in some of our actions that we've been taking. For example, we organized approximately 1,300 AJWS supporters, which is just so exciting, for the Women's March in Washington, D.C., New York, and Pennsylvania. Please stay tuned for additional marches that we're hoping you'll be joining us with. We also have issued action alerts asking you to call your senator, reach out, and tell them to stop the Rex Tillerson nomination. Thank you to those who have outreached. As we said earlier, he was formally appointed, but he actually enjoyed the least amount of support of any Secretary of State in the Senate in decades. And we know that that is also because of you articulating your voice as well. Some of you hopefully have been hearing about the refugee ban. We've issued also an action alert associated with that in terms of trying to articulate how much it is contrary to our Jewish values and how critical your voice is in speaking out in support of all refugees and ensuring that they can enter the country and not be banned for 120 days as they currently are. And also we're working hard in coalitions in Washington, D.C. and New York, looking at opportunities to work with Jewish leaders and other coalition leaders to really influence the programs, the strategies, and the approaches taken not only by this government, but to mitigate the harms of the policies that unfortunately we know are going to be coming down the pike after even what we've already experienced in these first 13 days. So we've been doing a lot. There's so much more we will be doing, and I know that so much of our success depends on your participation as well.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. So what can you do? What sorts of actions can you get involved in to support us and stand with us here at AJWS? It is really our strength, or the thousands of people like you watching today who join arms with us in a variety of actions like the ones that Jen spoke about. The urgency to act is absolutely here, and this is just the beginning of what will be a very long journey for all of us. And it is our work on behalf of the human rights of all of the advocates that we're talking about that will help to hold the line and mitigate some of the worst pulling back in protections of human rights around the globe that we will see. So what we would ask you to do when this session is over, to please click on your Facebook page to be part of actions going forward. In addition, if you haven't already taken part in our e-action as a result of the refugee ban and the ban on certain immigrants that was sent out on Friday, we ask you to please go to the AJWS website, ajws.org, and there you can find that e-action. We ask you to please reach out to your congresspeople about that executive order around the banning of all refugees from this country for 120 days. And we know that there will be many other opportunities for actions moving forward. So please check your Facebook page, check ajws.org in the months ahead. And one last thing we are certainly doing ourselves and ask that each of you do is today to be good to yourselves, to be good to those around you, and do something for yourself and for this world moving forward. Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon.